Amos Thorne was a relic of a bygone era, a man whose silence was as weathered and cracked as the dry riverbeds that scarred the Montana plains. In the late autumn of 1888, the general consensus among the townsfolk, from the chatter at the mercantile to the hushed gossip in the church pews, was that the old rancher had finally let the solitude rot his mind. They whispered that the isolation of his homestead, perched precariously on a wind-swept rise 3 miles out of town, had turned his eccentricity into genuine madness. The subject of their ridicule was not his age, nor his refusal to attend the Sunday socials, but a specific, bizarre endeavor he had undertaken as the frost began to bite the prairie grass. While other men were stockpiling coal and boarding up their windows with fresh pine, Amos was harvesting hay. He was not harvesting it to sell, nor strictly to feed the small herd of Morgan horses that constituted his entire worldly wealth. He was harvesting it, according to the confused observation of a passing peddler, to build a fortress. The irony of the situation was sharp and bitter. The townspeople believed Amos was preparing for his own folly, constructing a monument to senility that would collapse under the first heavy snow. They did not understand that Amos was the only one among them who was truly listening to the land. Amos stood by the split-rail fence, his knuckles swollen with arthritis, watching the northern horizon. The sky was a deceptive pale blue, but the air carried a metallic tang, a scent of ozone and deep frozen earth that signaled a shift in the atmospheric pressure. Beside him stood Midnight, his prize black mare, her breath pluming in the frigid morning air. She nudged his shoulder, sensing the tension in his posture. Amos wasn't looking at the clouds. He was looking through them. Remembering the winter of '76, the way the cattle had frozen standing up, statue still until they toppled over in the spring thaw. He knew that a wooden barn, no matter how thick the planks, was merely a sieve for the wind when the mercury dropped to 30 below. Wood conducted the cold. Gaps betrayed the warmth. He needed something else. He needed mass. The idea had come to him not from a book, but from watching a field mouse burrow into a forgotten stack of fodder during a sleet storm. The mouse had survived while the fox, exposed and shivering, had perished. The principle was simple, rooted in the laws of thermodynamics that Amos couldn't name but intimately understood. Trapped air was the enemy of frost. He looked back at his barn, a drafty structure of graying timber, and then at the mountains of hay bales he had spent weeks baling by hand. To the town, it looked like a fire hazard. To Amos, it looked like survival. The skepticism of the community was not passive. It was vocal and performative, enacted on the stage of the town square whenever Amos drove his wagon in for supplies. The ringleader of this mockery was usually Harlan Miller, a younger cattleman who prided himself on modern methods and expensive coal stoves. On a Tuesday in mid-November, as Amos loaded sacks of flour and coffee into his buckboard, Harlan leaned against a hitching post, a smirk playing under his thick mustache. "Reckon you're planning to feed the whole county with that stack you got out there, Thorne," Harlan called out, his voice carrying over the bustle of the street. A few bystanders chuckled, pausing their sweeping and loading to watch the spectacle. Amos paused, a sack of flour resting on his shoulder, and turned slowly. His eyes were the color of flint, unamused and unblinking. "Winter's coming, Harlan," Amos said, his voice a low gravel rumble. "Harder than the last." Harlan laughed, a sharp barking sound. "It's winter, old man. It gets cold. We buy coal. We don't build nests like a scared bird." The crowd laughed with him. They saw Amos's project as a regression, a move backward into primitivism. They didn't see the logic. They didn't see the physics. Amos finished loading his wagon in silence, ignoring the jabs about Thorne's folly and the suggestions that he might be planning to burn his own barn down for warmth. He climbed onto the seat, took the reins, and clicked his tongue to the team. As he rolled out of town, the laughter faded, replaced by the rhythmic creaking of the wheels. He did not feel shame. He felt a profound, pitying detachment. These men relied on supply chains, on coal shipments from the east that could be derailed by a single drift of snow. They relied on money to buy heat. Amos relied on leverage, density, and thermal mass. He knew that when the blizzard truly hit, the kind the indigenous elders spoke of with reverence, money would not burn hot enough to keep blood from freezing in the veins. He looked at the sky again. The blue was deepening, bruising into a purple gray at the edges. The barometer in his head, tuned by decades of sleeping under the stars, was screaming a warning. The mockery of his neighbors was just noise, as insubstantial as the chaff blowing off his wagon. The cold was the only truth that mattered, and it was coming to judge them all. The construction process was methodical, a slow-burn labor that defied the frantic, last-minute patching of the other ranchers. Amos did not simply pile the hay against the barn walls. He engineered a secondary skin for the structure. He treated each bale of hay like a kiln-fired brick, selecting them for density and squareness. He began on the north face, the side that would take the brunt of the prevailing winds. The labor was grueling. Each bale weighed upwards of 60 pounds, and Amos had to lift, position, and tamp them into place. He created a foundation row, setting the bales on a layer of gravel to prevent rot from ground moisture, displaying a foresight the townsfolk assumed he lacked. He stacked the bales in a running bond pattern, overlapping the seams just as a mason would with stone, ensuring there were no vertical fault lines for the wind to exploit. This wasn't just a pile, it was a wall, 3 feet thick, composed of compressed, dried stalks and, more importantly, millions of tiny pockets of dead air. As the wall rose, covering the weathered wood of the barn, Amos paid careful attention to the intersection of the hay and the eaves. He knew that heat rose, and if he sealed the barn too tight, the moisture from the horse's breath would condense, freeze, and create an icebox effect that could lead to pneumonia. He engineered ventilation channels, small, angled gaps near the roof line that would allow humid air to escape without letting the driving snow enter. He used loose straw to pack the crevices between the bales, using a wooden tamp he had whittled from an ash branch years ago. The work was rhythmic: lift, place, tamp, repeat. His breath steamed in the cooling air. His muscles burned, a dull, constant fire that kept him warm as the ambient temperature began to slide toward freezing. He worked from dawn until the last gray light faded from the west, fueled by jerky and stale coffee. Inside the barn, the change was already perceptible. The sharp drafts that usually whistled through the knotholes were silenced. The acoustic quality of the space changed, becoming hushed and womb-like. The horses, Midnight and the 2 draft horses, Buster and Daisy, seemed to sense the shift. They stood calmer, their ears flicking toward the walls that were slowly thickening against the coming dark. By early December, the Fortress of Folly, as Harlan had dubbed it, was complete. The barn was now encased in a 3-foot-thick layer of golden gray insulation, reaching all the way to the roofline. Amos had even banked earth and snow against the bottom course of bales to create a seal against the ground. The structure looked immense, a hulking, organic shape on the horizon, lacking the sharp lines of civilization but possessing a primal solidity. In town, the mood had shifted from mockery to a tense, frenetic anxiety. The telegraph lines had brought news of a massive low-pressure system moving down from the Canadian Shield, a white hurricane that had already buried depots in the Dakotas. The laughter at the general store had died out, replaced by the frantic purchasing of kerosene and extra blankets. Men were boarding up windows with frantic haste, hammering loudly against the encroaching silence. They trusted their wood stoves and their thin walls, believing that civilization was a shield against nature. Amos checked his work one last time. He walked the perimeter of the barn, running his gloved hand over the rough texture of the hay. It was solid. The wind, which was beginning to pick up, gusting in sharp, biting warnings, did not penetrate the mass. He went inside. The temperature differential was already 5 degrees warmer than the outside air, solely from the body heat of the 3 horses trapped within the insulated shell. He checked the water troughs, breaking a thin film of ice, and filled the mangers with extra timothy grass. Digestion created internal heat for the animals, fuel for the biological furnace. He patted Midnight's neck, feeling the thick winter coat she had grown. "You stay quiet now," he murmured to the mare. "Let them howl." He wasn't talking about the wolves. He secured the heavy barn doors, dropping the crossbar into place, and walked back to his small cabin. He didn't board up his windows. He had heavy wool quilts ready to hang. He sat in his rocking chair, the silence of the house heavy around him, and waited. The barometer on his wall tapped against the glass, the needle bottoming out. The waiting was the hardest part, the stillness before the violence. The storm did not arrive with a gradual build. It slammed into the valley like a hammer blow. One moment the air was still and painfully cold. The next, the world was erased by a wall of white. The wind shrieked, a high-pitched, tearing sound that sounded like metal being sheared. It was the kind of wind that sought out every weakness, every loose nail, every unsealed crack. In the town of Carbon Creek, the impact was immediate and catastrophic. The temperature plunged 30 degrees in 2 hours, a flash freeze that turned wet wood to stone and snapped tree limbs like dry kindling. Harlan Miller's house, a tall, proud 2-story structure, shuddered under the assault. The wind drove snow through the gaps in the siding, fine powder accumulating in the corners of the parlor, even with the stove roaring red hot. The draft was so severe it sucked the heat right up the chimney, leaving the residents huddled in coats within their own dining rooms. The physical reality of the storm was an assault on the senses. The roar was deafening, drowning out shouting, while the cold was a physical weight pressing in from all sides. Up on the ridge, the wind hit Amos's barn with the force of a locomotive, but there was no shuddering. The hay bales, dense and heavy, absorbed the kinetic energy of the gusts rather than resisting it rigidly. The wind didn't bang against the walls. It flowed over the rough texture, the turbulence broken up by the millions of stalks. Inside, the roar was muffled to a dull, distant drone. The violent shrieking that terrified the livestock in the town's wooden stables was reduced here to a background hum. Midnight flicked an ear but did not panic. The air inside remained still. There were no drafts cutting across the floor to freeze their hooves. The thermal mass of the hay began to do its work. It held the heat generated by the horses, reflecting it back into the space. The laws of thermodynamics were holding the line. While the townspeople frantically fed their stoves, fighting a losing battle against convection and conduction, Amos's horses were enveloped in a pocket of physics, protected not by fire, but by the humble, golden insulation of the field. The storm raged, burying the world in white. But inside the fortress of straw, the water in the trough remained liquid, and the air remained calm. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard hammered Carbon Creek with a ferocity that scrubbed the concept of civilization from the map. In the town, the situation deteriorated from anxiety to a desperate battle for survival. The wind found every microscopic gap in the clapboard siding of the houses, driving fine crystalline snow through keyholes and window frames until drifts formed on the parlor rugs. Harlan Miller, the man who had laughed loudest, found his modern world crumbling. His expensive cast-iron stove, voracious in its appetite, consumed his coal supply with terrifying speed, yet the heat seemed to vanish inches from the iron. The draft created by the temperature differential sucked the warmth straight up the chimney, leaving the air in the room stagnant and deadly. By the second night, the water in the pitcher on his bedside table had frozen solid. In his stables, the situation was grim. The single-walled wooden structure offered no resistance to the thermal leaching. The wind stripped the heat from the bodies of his cattle faster than their metabolisms could replace it. He could hear them lowing in the dark, a pitiful, shivering sound that cut through the howling wind, but he was powerless to help them. To open the door was to invite the storm in. 3 miles away, in the heart of the white void, Amos Thorne sat on an overturned bucket inside the hay-fortified barn. The contrast was so sharp it felt almost illicit. Outside, the wind chill was likely 50 degrees below zero, a temperature that turned flesh to stone. Inside, the air was heavy, humid, and surprisingly temperate. The thermometer hanging from a rafter read 42 degrees. It was not hot, but it was 70 degrees warmer than the air on the other side of the hay wall. The physics of the straw fortress were performing exactly as Amos had predicted. The 3-foot-thick walls of compressed stalks acted as a thermal break, halting the conductive loss of heat. The snow that had banked up against the exterior only added another layer of insulation, an igloo effect that further sealed the structure. The 3 horses, Midnight, Buster, and Daisy, were the furnace. Their large bodies radiated heat, heating the trapped air, which then circulated slowly in the high-ceilinged space before being reflected back down by the hay-packed loft. Amos listened to the rhythmic crunching of the horses chewing their oats. It was a sound of peace, of life continuing uninterrupted by the chaos outside. He adjusted the wick on his lantern, the soft yellow light absorbed by the golden walls, creating a glow that felt ancient and secure. He was not fighting the storm. He was outwaiting it, nestled in the belly of the harvest. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day, leaving behind a silence so profound it rang in the ears. The sun rose on a world transformed, sculpted into alien shapes of blinding white. The sky was a hard, brilliant azure, offering no heat, only light. Amos had to shoulder his way out of the barn, the snowdrift reaching nearly to the header of the door. He dug a trench with a flathead shovel, his breath pluming in the shattered air. When he finally broke through to the outside, he shielded his eyes against the glare. The landscape was unrecognizable. Fences were gone, buried under 6 feet of drift. The road to town was a mere suggestion, a smooth, undulating ribbon of white. He turned back to the barn. The structure was a shapeless mound of white, looking more like a hill than a building, but smoke drifted lazily from the small ventilation pipe he had rigged. He went back inside, checked the hooves of the horses, warm, dry, flexible, and nodded. It was time to see what was left of the world. He saddled Buster, the sturdy draft horse, knowing the deep snow would require raw power rather than midnight speed. He wrapped himself in buffalo hides and set out, the horse plunging chest deep into the powder, breaking a trail toward the valley floor. As Amos approached Carbon Creek, the devastation became apparent. There was no movement in the streets. The chimneys were smoking, but weakly. He rode past the Miller place first. The corral fences were buried, but the barn roof was visible. It was silent. Amos didn't stop. He rode straight to the town square, his horse snorting and steaming in the frigid air. A few figures were emerging from the snow-buried storefronts, looking shell-shocked and pale. When they saw Amos, a murmur went through them. They had assumed the old man on the ridge, exposed and alone, would be the first to perish. Instead, he sat atop his massive horse, looking like a king surveying a conquered land. Harlan Miller stumbled out of the livery stable, his face gray with exhaustion and soot. He looked up at Amos, his eyes hollow. "We lost the herd," Harlan croaked, his voice cracking. "Froze where they stood. The wind, it just went right through the wood." Amos looked down at him, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the grim reality of the high plains. "My barn is warm," Amos said simply. "Bring what you have left. If they can walk, they can live." The procession that followed was a humbling reversal of the natural order Carbon Creek had established. Men who had spent the autumn mocking the hay castle now trudged through the snow, leading their surviving, shivering, frost-bitten livestock toward it. Harlan Miller walked with his head down, leading a single shivering mare, his pride left frozen back in the valley. When the group reached Amos's homestead, they stopped, staring at the golden walls peeking out from the snowdrifts. Amos dismounted and slid the heavy bar from the door, swinging it open. A cloud of warm, oat-scented steam rolled out, hitting the freezing men in the face. It was the smell of life. They led the animals inside, and the reaction was instantaneous. The men stopped, pulling off their gloves, their mouths agape. It wasn't just shelter, it was a sanctuary. The silence of the insulation, the palpable retention of heat, the dryness of the air, it defied their understanding of winter. Harlan reached out and touched the wall of hay bales, his hands shaking. He realized then that the folly was a master class in engineering. He looked at Amos, who was quietly pouring fresh water into a trough. I didn't know, Harlan whispered. We didn't know. Amos didn't look up. Cold doesn't care what you know, he said. It only cares what you build. The weeks that followed the Great Whiteout changed the social fabric of the territory. Amos's barn became the communal stable for the town's remaining breeding stock. The neighbors took turns breaking the trail to the ridge, hauling feed and supplies, eager to pay their rent and labor. Among them was Martha Higgins, a widow who ran the mercantile and had lost her 2 carriage horses in the storm. She was a woman of sharp wit and practical mind, one of the few who hadn't openly mocked Amos, though she had certainly doubted him. She came up every Tuesday to check on the town's stock, often bringing a pot of stew or a loaf of fresh bread. She watched Amos work, observing the economy of his movements, the way he spoke to the animals with a gentleness he rarely showed to people. She saw not a crazy hermit, but a man of profound capability. One afternoon, as they pitched fresh straw into the stalls, the sunlight filtering through the vents and catching the dust motes, Martha leaned on her pitchfork. "You realize they were laughing at you," she stated, not asking. Amos paused, wiping his brow. "I heard 'em," he admitted. "Doesn't make the wind blow any softer." Martha nodded, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "No, but it makes the quiet in here sound a lot like victory. And I suppose a man who can build a summer in the middle of winter is a man worth listening to." Spring arrived with a violent thaw, turning the plains into a sea of mud, but the livestock that emerged from Amos's barn were sleek and healthy. The town of Carbon Creek began to rebuild, but the architecture changed. The new barns that went up that summer were different. They were banked with earth. They had double walls packed with straw. The thorn method became the new standard, whispered about in feed stores 3 counties over. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a deferential respect that made Amos uncomfortable. He preferred the solitude. However, the solitude was no longer absolute. The bond forged in the hay barn between the rancher and the widow had deepened with the melting snow. It wasn't a romance of poetry and flowers. It was a partnership of shared survival and mutual respect. On a Sunday in June, when the wildflowers were exploding across the prairie, Amos drove his buckboard to the mercantile, not for supplies, but for Martha. They were married in the small church that had once buzzed with gossip about his madness. Harlan Miller sat in the front row, his hat in his hands, respectful and silent. Decades later, long after the internal combustion engine had replaced the horse, the legacy of that winter remained stamped on the land. Amos and Martha grew old together on the ridge, their homestead expanding, but never losing its connection to the earth. They raised horses that were renowned for their hardiness, and they raised children who knew the difference between fashion and function. The original hay barn eventually returned to the earth, the bales composted into the soil to feed the next generation of grass. But the lesson remained. Amos Thorne died in his sleep at the age of 90, a man who had outlived his critics and outsmarted the elements. In the local history books, under the chapter on the Great Blizzard of '88, there is a photograph of him standing next to Martha. his hand resting on the rough, golden wall of a hay bale barn. The caption doesn't mention the laughter of the neighbors. It simply reads, Amos Thorne, pioneer engineer. He listened to the wind, and the wind spared him. The giggle of the town had been silenced by the storm, but the warmth of Amos's ingenuity echoed down through the generations, a testament to the quiet power of being right when the rest of the world is wrong.